Albert Graham had never believed in revenge. His life had been built on logic, not emotion. 30 years in corporate law had taught him that the world rewarded precision, not passion, restraint, not impulse. He'd spent a lifetime believing that if you played by the rules, eventually justice balanced itself out. But that illusion cracked one February evening in Los Angeles, under chandelier light, over polished wine glasses, and behind the smiling cruelty of his future son-in-law. The engagement dinner was held at the Silver Lake Conservatory, a glass-walled modernist venue that looked out over the reservoir and the city's glittering skyline. The event was supposed to be a celebration, an elegant welcome into a family, a merging of lives. Instead, it became a public execution of dignity. Before we start, please like and subscribe to our channel and stay tuned. Albert had flown in from Boston for the occasion. He wore a gray suit, clean, conservative, perfectly pressed. It was the kind of suit that didn't ask for attention, a suit of quiet confidence, not ostentation. But from the moment he entered, he felt it. That faint electric tension that comes when people are too rich, too self-satisfied to hide their judgment. Nicholas Rowan's world, the world his daughter Elena was marrying into, smelled of startup wealth and moral decay. Nicholas was the type of man magazines called visionary. 33 years old, Silicon Valley golden boy, founder of Horizon Path Technologies, a digital health company with a billion-dollar valuation and almost no product. His investors called him the next Musk. His critics called him a fraud. To Albert, he was something simpler, a narcissist with money and no soul. "Albert," Nicholas exclaimed as he approached, his tone bubbling with the insincerity of someone performing charm for an audience. "You made it. I was worried your flight might get delayed. Economy flights are unpredictable these days, right?" The surrounding guests laughed, as if on cue. Albert smiled politely. Fortunately, American Airlines still manages to land on time. Nicholas tilted his head. "Ah, commercial. So humble of you." Elena's smile froze. She gave her fiancé a small warning look. But Nicholas wasn't the type to notice, let alone care. Dinner began soon after. Long tables draped in white linen stretched under golden lights. Waiters moved like clockwork, serving truffle risotto, wagyu carpaccio, and Bordeaux so old it could have been bottled when honesty still mattered. Albert tried to make conversation with Nicholas's parents, but they were too busy bragging about their safari in Botswana and their private chef in the Maldives. Across the table, Nicholas dominated the conversation, spinning tales of venture capital meetings and disrupting the future. Albert had been listening quietly, a habit of lawyers, one that gave the illusion of passivity. But when he finally spoke, his voice carried calm authority. "So tell me, Nicholas," he said, "how does your company measure the ethical risks of medical data usage?" Nicholas blinked, then smirked. "Ethics, that's cute. You mean how do we make sure the lawyers are happy?" A few guests chuckled. Albert's expression didn't change. "No, I mean how do you make sure patients aren't exploited for profit?" Nicholas shrugged. "Look, people sign terms and conditions. If they don't read them, that's on them." Albert met his gaze. "You remind me of some of my old clients. Smart, ambitious, certain they're untouchable. Most of them ended up testifying for the prosecution." The laughter at the table went silent. Nicholas leaned back, jaw tightening, a flicker of ego bruised. Then he smiled again, thin and sharp. "You've still got that lawyer's bite, huh? I like that. Maybe you can help us someday. I hear compliance officers are making a comeback." Elena touched her father's hand under the table, a silent plea, "Don't take the bait." He didn't. He only smiled faintly and said, "I'm retired, Nicholas, but thank you for the offer." The tension lingered like smoke. By the time dessert arrived, a ridiculous gold-leaf chocolate mousse, Nicholas had grown louder, drunkard, and more reckless. He stood up to give a toast. "To Elena," he said, raising his glass, "the most beautiful woman I've ever met. and to her father, Albert, who taught her the value of humility and thrift. He gestured toward Albert's modest suit, grinning. "Seriously, Albert, do you own any designer clothes, or do you just rent them for special occasions?" The laughter that followed was deafening. Elena's mouth opened, but no words came out. Albert didn't move. He simply set his glass down and looked at Nicholas, long enough for the younger man to falter, just for a second, as if he'd glimpsed something he couldn't name. When Albert finally spoke, his voice was calm, so calm it silenced the room. "Some men," he said, "measure worth by what they wear, others by what they've earned." Then he stood, excused himself politely, and walked out into the cold night air. He didn't say goodbye to anyone. He didn't speak to Elena. He simply drove back to his hotel, packed his suitcase, and took the first flight to Boston the next morning. On the plane, somewhere over Kansas, as the clouds blurred beneath him like streaks of smoke, something inside Albert hardened. He replayed every smirk, every laugh, every insult. He remembered the helpless look on his daughter's face, a look that told him she'd already begun excusing Nicholas's cruelty. That was when he decided. He wouldn't forgive Nicholas Rowan. He wouldn't confront him, argue, or shout. He would erase him, methodically, intelligently, completely. Albert Graham was no ordinary retiree. Before he'd started his quiet consulting practice, he'd spent decades as one of the most feared corporate investigators in the country. The man Fortune 500 companies called when they needed scandals contained or enemies neutralized quietly. He knew how reputations were built. He also knew how to destroy them, cleanly, legally, and permanently. Nicholas Rowan had humiliated him in public. Now, Albert would destroy him in public. Back in Boston, Albert returned to his study, a quiet, wood-paneled room overlooking the Charles River. The city outside was gray and cold, the kind of winter light that made even victories feel temporary. He sat at his desk, opened his laptop, and began his research. Not as a father, but as an investigator. He started with Horizon Path Technologies, corporate filings, board members, offshore subsidiaries. Then he went deeper. He followed digital trails through shell companies registered in the Cayman Islands, Belize, and Ireland. Within days, he'd already found patterns: suspicious transactions, circular funding, inflated valuations. Within a week, he found what he was looking for: falsified trial data. Nicholas's billion-dollar company was built on sand, false metrics, staged studies, doctored patient outcomes. Albert's pulse didn't quicken. He didn't smile. He just began to organize. 2 weeks later, he called an old colleague, Miriam Klein, a retired forensic accountant known in legal circles as the Quiet Wolf. "Miriam," he said, "I need verification. Quietly. No paper trail." She sighed on the other end. "You're not back in the game, are you?" "Let's just say I'm teaching an old lesson," Albert replied. By the end of the month, Miriam had returned with confirmation. "Albert," she said over coffee in Cambridge, her eyes wide, "he's a fraud, a big one. The SEC hasn't caught it yet, but if this surfaces, it'll destroy him." Albert stirred his coffee slowly. "Then it's only a matter of time." Miriam leaned closer. "You're really going to do this?" Albert looked out the window at the Charles, the gray river shifting beneath the winter light. He thought I was a man past his prime. Let's see how he handles a real opponent. That night, Albert opened a new digital folder on his desktop. He named it simply Rowan, Case File. Inside, he began placing everything: documents, bank statements, emails, screenshots. Every line Nicholas had ever told now had a timestamp. Every fake document now had metadata. And every insult from that dinner now had a consequence. When he finally shut down his computer, the clock read 3:17 a.m. The city was silent. Albert stood by the window, the river below reflecting faint streetlight ripples. He wasn't angry anymore. Not exactly. What he felt was something colder, quieter, and infinitely more dangerous: purpose. The rain came early that spring in Boston. Slow, deliberate, a kind of weather that rewarded patience. Albert liked that. Patience was the skeleton of every successful plan. Revenge, he decided, wasn't fire. It was architecture. Every morning began the same: coffee, 2 eggs, and a legal pad filled with neat, methodical handwriting. At the top of every page, 3 words appeared in block letters: Nicholas Rowan, liability. He had built cases his entire career: corporate fraud, insider trading, money laundering. He knew how systems failed, where people broke, and how greed made men leave footprints even when they thought they were invisible. Now he was building one final case, not for a client, but for himself. Albert wrote down 3 principles on the first page of his notebook: information, isolation, exposure. Every act of destruction required those 3 steps. He already had information, enough data to hang Nicholas in any federal courtroom. Isolation would come next, cutting Nicholas off from his allies, investors, and credibility. And exposure would be the grand finale, a public collapse so complete that Nicholas's name would become synonymous with deceit. He created a new digital identity: Julian North. A believable ghost, British, mid-40s, corporate whistleblower type. He set up an encrypted Proton Mail account, a VPN chain through 3 countries, and a voice synthesizer to alter his tone for calls. Julian North didn't just exist, he had a digital footprint. Old LinkedIn posts, comments on financial blogs, a Twitter account inactive for 6 years. Enough to be found if someone checked, but not enough to raise suspicion. From Julian North, Albert composed a message to a name he hadn't spoken aloud in years: Laura Penn, investigative journalist, The Atlantic. They'd met once at an ethics symposium in D.C., where Albert had lectured on corporate accountability. She'd been sharp, relentless, the kind of reporter who smelled blood in numbers. Subject: concerning Horizon Path Technologies, potential securities fraud. Mr. Penn, you don't know me, but you've written about the tech sector's blind spots before. There's a story you've missed, one with billions at stake and patient safety on the line. If you're willing to verify, I'll share documents that show deliberate investor deception, insider manipulation, and falsified health data. J. North. He hit send. Then he waited. Within 24 hours, her reply appeared. If you can prove what you're saying, I'm listening. Albert smiled faintly. The first hook had caught. He didn't stop there. Whispers, he knew, could destroy faster than facts, because fear spread before truth did. Using the same alias, he created anonymous accounts on Reddit's finance boards and small investment forums. He seeded questions, never accusations. Anyone else notice Horizon Path deleted their clinical trial results last quarter? Weird that their FDA approval data vanished from the site. Something off here. Feels a bit Theranosy, doesn't it? Nothing defamatory, just curiosity. Weaponized. By the end of the week, a few analysts began murmuring. Someone tweeted a thread. Horizon Path stock dipped 3%, then 5%. Not much, but enough for Nicholas to feel it. And Albert wanted him to feel it. Every empire fell through its weakest subject, and Albert knew where to look. Horizon's CFO, Brian Cole, was a man with expensive taste and poor judgment. Miriam's background checks had revealed the perfect crack: $480,000 in gambling debt, owed not to banks, but to private lenders who didn't take IOUs. Albert reached out again through Julian North. Mr. Cole, I know you're under pressure. I also know what your company has been hiding. If you'd like to protect yourself, I can help. We should talk before this reaches the regulators. JN. He expected a week of silence. Instead, Brian replied within hours. Who are you? What do you want? Albert's reply was calm. Just the truth. They spoke that night on a scrambled call line routed through Switzerland. Albert's voice, digitally altered, was smooth and unhurried. Brian cracked within 15 minutes. Panic made men confess quicker than guilt. He spoke about doctored clinical data, ghost-written research, and manipulated investor reports. He admitted to falsifying signatures on FDA correspondence at Nicholas's direction. Albert recorded every word. When Brian asked why he was helping, Albert replied, "Because someone should make sure the truth doesn't get buried." The irony wasn't lost on him. By April, the framework was ready. Albert had built an invisible machine. Every lever, every trigger perfectly aligned. He tested each part. The journalist, primed with verified evidence. The whistleblower identity, protected by plausible deniability. The financial rumor mill, already vibrating with unease. The digital dossier, time-stamped and encrypted. He even rehearsed the timeline, down to the minute, the way an attorney rehearses an opening argument. The question wasn't if Nicholas would fall. It was how loudly. The wedding invitations arrived in mid-April. Cream-colored cardstock embossed with gold. A private vineyard in Napa Valley. Guest list, senators, CEOs, influencers. Albert RSVP'd, yes. When Elena called, her voice carried cautious hope. "Dad, Nick really wants to make peace. He said he was out of line that night." Albert's tone was gentle. "Tell him I'm looking forward to seeing him again." He was, just not in the way she imagined. The week before the wedding, Albert flew to San Francisco, not to attend parties, but to conduct reconnaissance. Horizon Path's headquarters stood like a monument to ego, a minimalist glass cube in Palo Alto. Albert visited posing as an investor, Julian North, International Health Ventures. He wore a navy suit, carried a leather briefcase, and spoke with an accent polished enough to disarm suspicion. He took a guided tour of the offices, asked informed questions, and let others talk too much. The receptionist flinched at Nicholas's name. The lead engineer muttered about data revisions. Fear hung in the air like humidity. Albert noticed small things, the smell of stress, the silence when he asked about clinical results, the way one employee's eyes darted to another before answering. He collected business cards, snapped photos of internal memos left on printer trays, and downloaded public reports to cross-reference later. By the time he left California, his evidence folder had doubled. Nicholas wasn't just a fraud, he was reckless. And recklessness was easy to collapse. Back in Boston, Albert refined the final act. He compiled 150 pages of documents, charts, and email chains, all verified by Merriam. Then he compressed the files into an encrypted zip and sent them to Laura Penn with one sentence. "You'll want to schedule publication for May 14th. She replied within minutes. "That's oddly specific. Why?" "Because timing is everything." "That's the wedding date, isn't it?" "Exactly." Laura hesitated. "You're not just exposing fraud, you're destroying a man." Albert typed back. "Sometimes justice looks like destruction." He set up 2 burner phones, one for investor leaks, one for media alerts. Then he programmed them for automated messages. Timeline: 8 a.m., May 14th, first market rumor leak. 10 a.m., The Atlantic article goes live. 11:30 a.m., SEC receives formal complaint. 1 p.m., wedding ceremony begins. He calculated the time zones, press release intervals, and expected social media reaction curve. By 3 p.m., Horizon Path's stock would be in free fall. By 4 p.m., Nicholas's board would suspend him. And by nightfall, the man who mocked him over dinner would no longer have a company, a career, or a reputation. Albert printed the plan on a single page, folded it neatly, and locked it in his desk drawer. He didn't need to look at it again. The night before the wedding, Albert checked into a quiet hotel overlooking Napa Valley. The vineyards stretched for miles, the air thick with the scent of rain and distant lavender. He poured himself a glass of whiskey, sat by the window, and watched the storm roll in from the west. He wasn't angry anymore. He wasn't even nervous. He felt something rarer, clarity. People misunderstood revenge. They thought it was about heat, passion, rage. But Albert knew the truth. The best revenge was cold. It required control, patience, and the absence of mercy. He raised his glass to the empty room. "To consequences," he murmured. Outside, thunder rolled over the valley. At precisely 8:01 a.m. the next morning, his first message went out. Breaking. Sources suggest Horizon Path Technologies under SEC scrutiny for falsified medical data. Developing story. By 8:10, Bloomberg's algorithmic feeds picked it up. By 9, finance Twitter was ablaze. By 9:30, Nicholas's investors were calling his phone nonstop. At 10 a.m., The Atlantic published Laura Penn's expose, The Lie Behind Horizon Path, How a billion-dollar startup endangered lives for profit. By 10:45, Horizon Path stock had dropped 42%, and the wedding hadn't even started yet. Albert closed his laptop, slipped on his cufflinks, and straightened his tie. Outside, the first guests were arriving at the vineyard estate. Laughter, champagne, luxury. They were walking into a tragedy disguised as a celebration. Albert checked his watch, smiled faintly, and whispered, "Showtime." The morning sun over Napa Valley was too calm, the kind of serene golden light that made everything look perfect. Rows of vineyards stretched like veins of green across the hills, and the air smelled faintly of wet earth and champagne. Albert Graham woke before dawn. He dressed slowly, deliberately. A navy suit, polished shoes, no tie pin, no flair. The same kind of suit Nicholas had mocked months ago, a symbol of restraint. In the mirror, Albert saw a man with silver hair, composed eyes, and a stillness that came from knowing exactly what was about to happen. He placed his phone face down on the dresser, took a long breath, and whispered, "Let it burn." The Rowan estate stood like a temple of excess. Olive trees lined the driveway, marble fountains reflected the cloudless sky, and black Teslas glided silently toward the valet circle. Security men in suits scanned invitations like it was a political summit. Albert's name was on the list. "Mr. Graham," said the attendant with a practiced smile, "welcome. It's an honor to have you." Albert nodded and walked through the gates, into a world built on borrowed perfection. The guests shimmered with wealth. Tuxedos, designer gowns, champagne flutes raised under hanging lights. The event was already trending online. #RowanWedding pulsed across Instagram before the ceremony even began. A live jazz trio played near the reflecting pool. Waiters glided through with trays of caviar and rosé, and everywhere Nicholas Rowan's name glowed, on menus, on photo backdrops, on people's lips. Albert moved quietly among them, unnoticed, a shadow of composure amid laughter and vanity. He watched Nicholas from across the courtyard. The young man was magnetic. White tuxedo, sculpted grin, shaking hands with a senator as if he owned the world. Elena stood beside him, radiant but anxious, her smile trembling at the edges. Albert felt a flicker of something. Pity, maybe, but it passed. 10:15 a.m. His phone vibrated once. He didn't look at it. He already knew. At first, nothing changed. The music continued, the champagne flowed, The illusion of control held. Then, slowly, the atmosphere shifted. Near the bar, two guests stopped laughing. One frowned at his phone. Another whispered to her husband, showing him a headline. Wait, isn't that his company? Something about an investigation? No way, Horizon Path? The murmurs spread like wildfire, quiet at first, then rippling across the crowd. Dozens of glowing screens appeared like fireflies in daylight. Albert stood perfectly still, watching the panic bloom. Then came the first visible tremor. Nicholas's best man, a venture capitalist named Tom Decker, stepped aside, phone pressed to his ear, his expression draining of color. "What do you mean they halted trading?" he hissed. Albert allowed himself the faintest smile. Phase 1, complete. Nicholas noticed something was wrong within minutes. The laughter around him had grown forced. Conversation stuttered mid-sentence. Cameras began turning away. He excused himself from a group of investors, took out his phone, and froze. There it was, his empire in flames. Breaking. SEC launches investigation into Horizon Path Technologies for securities and medical fraud. The headline stared back at him like a mirror. He looked around, scanning the courtyard, searching for something solid. And that's when his eyes locked on Albert Graham, standing calmly near the bar. For a second, the entire world seemed to stop. Nicholas's grin faltered, his pupils tightened. He knew. He didn't know how, but he knew. Albert raised his glass slightly, a quiet, almost polite salute. Then he took a slow sip. Nicholas's jaw tightened. "Excuse me," he muttered, brushing past guests as whispers followed him like static. He found Tom near the terrace. "What the hell's going on?" Nicholas demanded. Tom looked pale. "The article dropped an hour ago. The Atlantic. They've got documents, signatures, everything. SEC's already moving. Brian Cole? Disappeared." Nicholas blinked. "Brian what?" Tom's voice cracked. He flipped Nick. "He's testifying." Nicholas's world spun. His hands shook as he scrolled, scanning the lines of the article. Every secret he thought buried, the falsified data, the shell accounts, the Cayman transfers, laid out in black and white. His phone buzzed again. Dozens of missed calls, board members, investors, his PR firm. "Jesus Christ," he whispered. The officiant stepped up to the podium, smiling nervously. "Ladies and gentlemen, please take your seats. We're about to begin." But no one moved. Half the guests were staring at their phones. The others were whispering, recording, pretending not to. The wedding planner's smile froze into panic. Nicholas turned toward the crowd. His face glistened with sweat. "Everyone, please," he said, forcing a laugh. "There's been some kind of misunderstanding. It's fake news, a smear campaign." A voice from the audience cut through the air. "The Atlantic isn't fake news." Laughter, uneasy, scattered, rippled through the guests. Nicholas's expression shattered. "Who said that?" he snapped. No answer, only silence, the kind that hums right before a career dies. Albert stepped forward through the frozen crowd. Elena turned, relief and confusion flooding her face. "Dad," she whispered. Albert's tone was steady. "It's all right, sweetheart." Nicholas turned too, eyes wide, veins pulsing at his temple. "You," he said under his breath, "you did this." Albert tilted his head. "What makes you think I did anything?" "Don't play games with me, old man," Nicholas hissed. "You think you can ruin me. You have no idea who you're dealing with." Albert smiled faintly. "On the contrary, I know exactly who I'm dealing with." Nicholas's breath quickened. "I'll recover. My lawyers will—" Albert leaned in just enough for only him to hear. "Brian Cole, Cayman accounts, forged FDA documents. Still want to talk about lawyers?" Nicholas froze. His face went pale. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. Albert straightened, calm again. "You should have learned humility, Nicholas. It lasts longer than arrogance." The younger man stumbled back, disoriented, his composure disintegrating as camera phones caught every moment. "Elena," he gasped, "I can explain." But Elena's face had already changed. The love was gone. In its place, understanding. "I don't think you can," she said softly. By 11:30 a.m., the wedding was over. Unofficially, silently. Guests drifted toward the exits in hushed clusters. The band packed up mid-song. A few reporters hovered outside the gates. Nicholas sat alone at a table near the bar, head in his hands, phone buzzing with unanswered calls. His best man had vanished. His parents were arguing with security. Elena was inside the mansion, surrounded by friends, crying quietly. Albert stayed by the courtyard's edge, watching the aftermath unfold with clinical detachment. Justice didn't need applause. Laura Penn's article had already been picked up by Reuters, CNBC, and The Guardian. By noon, Horizon Path's board had suspended Nicholas pending investigation. By evening, the DOJ had announced a preliminary inquiry. By midnight, the empire was gone. Albert finished his drink, set the glass down, and walked toward the valet. No one stopped him. No one noticed him. The sun had risen higher, glaring off the glass walls of the estate, a harsh, honest light. His phone buzzed once, a message from an unknown number. "You destroyed him." MK. Albert replied, "No, he destroyed himself. I just made sure everyone saw it." He slipped the phone into his pocket as his car arrived. He drove down Highway 29, the road winding through miles of vineyards glowing under late afternoon sun. The radio murmured news updates, SEC subpoenas, market panic, investor lawsuits. He turned it off. The only sound was the hum of the tires and the faint rhythm of his heartbeat, slow, steady, resolved. He wasn't happy. Happiness wasn't the point. What he felt was balance. The world had been corrected, if only slightly. That night, back at his inn, Albert poured another glass of whiskey and sat by the window, watching rain streak the glass. His phone vibrated. Elena. He hesitated, then answered. Her voice trembled. "Dad, I don't even know what to say. I saw everything. I read the article. I feel sick. But I think I understand now." Albert said nothing. "You were trying to protect me," she whispered. He closed his eyes. Always. Silence, just the sound of rain. "I love you, Dad," she said softly. "Please come see me tomorrow." Albert nodded to no one. The rain fell harder, drumming against the window like punctuation. He sat there until midnight, the empty glass beside him, the storm fading into calm. Outside, the valley lay washed clean. Inside, Albert Graham, the man who never believed in revenge, finally understood what it meant to win without joy. The days after the wedding unfolded like a slow-motion implosion. News feeds burned with headlines. TV anchors traded speculation for ratings. Nicholas Rowan's fall was the kind of spectacle that the world devoured with guiltless fascination. Tech prodigy under federal investigation, from billion-dollar visionary to criminal defendant. Horizon Path CEO accused of medical data fraud. For 3 days, Nicholas's face was everywhere. The same grin that once graced magazine covers now became a symbol of hubris. And somewhere in Boston, far from the chaos, Albert Graham folded his newspaper, poured his coffee, and stared out the window as though nothing at all had changed. In truth, everything had. He'd expected satisfaction, relief, maybe, something. Instead, what came was silence. The world's noise had been deafening during the fall, but once the crash ended, there was only the quiet. Albert moved through his house the way a soldier moves after a war, cautiously, as if afraid to disturb the peace he'd fought for. The Charles River glimmered beyond his window. Ducks traced small ripples through the reflection of morning light. He realized then that revenge didn't sing, it didn't celebrate, it simply stopped. Like a verdict delivered, a gavel struck, and the courtroom emptied. Balance restored, but never joyfully. The collapse of Horizon Path happened faster than anyone imagined. Within 48 hours, trading was suspended. By the end of the week, the board forced Nicholas to resign. The SEC froze his accounts, and the Department of Justice announced a joint investigation. The CFO, Brian Cole, the weak link Albert had found, confessed almost immediately. His sworn affidavit included every detail: falsified trial data, forged FDA reports, insider manipulation. And attached to that affidavit was a recording, the one Albert had made. It was airtight, unassailable, devastating. By early June, federal charges were filed: wire fraud, securities fraud, obstruction of justice. Nicholas's bail hearing made national television. Cameras flashed as he walked into court in a wrinkled suit, hand trembling at the cuff. His once perfect hair was unkempt, his eyes darted, hunted, desperate. The same people who once toasted his genius now whispered about his arrogance. Horizon Path's investors sued, the company's assets were liquidated, patients affected by the fake data filed class action suits. Nicholas's name, once a symbol of innovation, now meant deception. And Albert? He didn't attend the hearings, he didn't give interviews, he simply watched the tide turn, quiet, steady, unblinking. 2 weeks later, Elena came to see him. It was a gray afternoon. She stood at the door of his townhouse in jeans and a sweater, hair tied back, her face stripped of the glamour that had once accompanied Nicholas's world. "Dad," she said softly. Albert opened the door wider. "Come in." They sat in the kitchen. The smell of coffee lingered in the air. Light fell through the blinds in golden bars, dividing the table into patterns of warmth and shadow. For a long time, neither spoke. Then she said, "I read everything. The article, the documents, the testimony. You knew, didn't you? Even before the wedding?" Albert nodded once. "Yes." Her eyes shimmered. "Then why didn't you tell me?" He took a slow breath. "Because you wouldn't have believed me. You were in love, and love, my dear, makes even the smartest people blind." Elena looked down, twisting the ring she no longer wore. "You didn't just expose him, Dad. You destroyed him." Albert's voice was calm. "He destroyed himself. I just handed him the mirror." She was silent for a moment. Then, "Do you regret it?" He met her gaze. Her mother's eyes stared back, kind but unyielding. "Regret isn't the right word," he said. "Regret implies I did something wrong. What I did was necessary. But necessary things are rarely clean." Elena's voice broke. "He humiliated you that night, didn't he?" Albert smiled faintly. "That's not why I did it. I did it because he was going to hurt you. People like Nicholas don't stop. They escalate. I just accelerated the ending." Tears glistened on her lashes. "He's facing years in prison." "I know." She reached across the table and took his hand. "And what now?" Albert looked out the window at the drifting light over the river. "Now we live. That's all that's left after justice." 3 months passed. Summer gave way to early fall. One morning, Albert received an official envelope. United States v. Nicholas Rowan, sentencing hearing September 22nd. He hadn't planned to go, but the night before the hearing, he found himself driving north on instinct, his old Volvo humming quietly down Interstate 93. The courthouse loomed gray and solemn against the dawn. Inside, the benches were filled with journalists, investors, former employees. The air buzzed with anticipation, that electric thrill of watching power punished. Nicholas sat at the defense table, thinner now, his arrogance stripped bare. His eyes were hollow but alert, as though he'd finally met the person he'd been running from, himself. When the judge asked if he had anything to say, Nicholas stood. His voice cracked on the first word. "I don't have excuses," he said. "I thought I could outsmart the world. I thought I was better. But the truth is, I'm just another man who thought rules didn't apply to him." He hesitated, glancing briefly toward the back of the courtroom, toward Albert. "I thought I could buy respect. But some people," he said quietly, "earn it." The room went still. The judge handed down the sentence: 11 years in federal prison, restitution to investors, and permanent ban from corporate directorship. The gavel struck once, and it was done. Outside, the air was sharp with autumn. Albert stood on the courthouse steps, watching reporters swarm below. Microphones, flashes, questions, a circus built around ruin. He didn't move. The marble railing beneath his hand was cold. The leaves across the street rattled softly in the wind. Revenge, he thought, was a strange kind of justice. It didn't heal, it didn't restore. It merely balanced, like a scale that didn't care who bled to make it even. He sat on a bench across the street and exhaled slowly. For the first time in months, he felt the absence of weight. His phone buzzed, a message from Miriam Klein. "It's done. You can rest now." He typed back, "Justice served." Then he deleted the conversation. Some things, he knew, were better left erased. That evening, Albert drove to the coast. The Massachusetts shoreline was quiet, cold, metallic water crashing against black rocks. He walked until his shoes were soaked through. The wind cut through his coat, sharp but clean. He thought of his wife, gone for years now, and the words she used to say when his work consumed him. "Justice without mercy is pride in disguise." He wondered if she would have approved of what he'd done. Probably not. But she would have understood. He sat on a driftwood log, watching the waves. The horizon glowed gold and gray, the same color as the whiskey he'd toasted with the night before the wedding. He realized something then. Revenge hadn't changed who he was. It had only revealed him. A man who believed in balance. A man who understood cost. And sometimes, cost was the only currency that mattered. Months later, a plain envelope arrived in Albert's mailbox. The return address read, Federal Correctional Institution, Mendota, CA. He almost threw it away, but curiosity, or conscience, made him open it. Inside was a single handwritten letter. "Albert, you won. I know that. I've had a lot of time to think, and I've realized something you probably already knew. I wasn't really fighting you. I was fighting myself. I thought I could build a kingdom out of lies. You just lit the match. Tell Elena I'm sorry. N.R." Albert folded the letter carefully, placed it back in the envelope, and set it on his desk. He didn't respond. Some stories didn't need sequels. Spring came again. The river thawed. Cherry blossoms lined the streets like pale confetti. One afternoon, Elena came to visit, this time with her newborn son. She smiled when she handed the baby to him. "Meet Nicholas Albert Graham. Middle name for you, first name for forgiveness." Albert looked down at the sleeping child, soft, warm, unspoiled by the world's cruelty. Tiny fingers curled around his thumb. "Forgiveness," he said quietly. "That's a rare thing these days." Elena smiled. "You earned it." He wasn't sure he agreed. But as he rocked the baby gently, the past loosened its grip. Outside, the blossoms drifted across the river, pink petals floating like verdicts finally delivered. Albert thought of everything, the humiliation, the planning, the reckoning, and felt something close to peace. Justice, he decided, wasn't about punishment. It was about restoration. And sometimes, even the most calculated revenge could plant the seed for grace. The afternoon light shifted, catching the water in golden ripples. Albert watched the reflections move, slow and steady, like time forgiving itself. For the first time in years, he smiled. Not the smile of victory, the smile of balance. Years passed quietly. as the noise of ambition fades. The scandal of Horizon Path became old news. Other tech prodigies rose and fell, new frauds replaced the old, and the public moved on to fresher spectacles. But for Albert Graham, time didn't erase the memory, it only softened its edges. His life had returned to stillness. The Charles River flowed as it always had, silver in morning light and black in the cold evenings. His days were simple now: breakfast at 8, long walks through Cambridge, reading by the window until the light faded into dusk. Sometimes he thought about what had happened, not as a triumph, but as a turning point. Revenge had changed the trajectory of many lives, Nicholas's, Elena's, even his own. It had left behind not ashes, but silence. Silence was heavier than guilt. He found himself wondering if Nicholas had changed in prison, if confinement had stripped away his arrogance or simply replaced it with bitterness. Albert never checked. He didn't need to know. Some truths, he'd learned, didn't need witnesses. He did, however, keep one reminder. On his bookshelf, between volumes of legal theory and classic novels, sat an unmarked envelope. Inside it was Nicholas's final letter, creased, faded, but intact. Sometimes Albert would look at it, never opening it again, as if its mere existence proved something essential, that even arrogance could learn reflection, given enough consequence. It was early autumn when Elena came again. The air smelled of rain and distant smoke. The leaves were turning amber along the riverbank, and the world felt like it was exhaling another year. Albert was sitting on the porch, wrapped in a wool coat, a book resting on his lap. When he saw his daughter's car pull into the driveway, a small, unguarded smile formed on his face. Elena stepped out, holding the hand of her little boy, now 5 years old. "Say hi to Grandpa," she said. The child ran up to him, eyes bright, cheeks red from the cold. "Hi, Grandpa Albert." Albert bent down, lifting him easily into his lap. "My, you've grown," he said. "You look just like your mother." The boy grinned. "Mom says I'm smart like you." Albert chuckled softly. "I hope she's wrong about that. Smart men make too many mistakes." Elena sat beside him on the porch steps. For a long while they just watched the river together. Then she said quietly, "They're transferring him. Nicholas." Albert's eyes stayed on the water. "Where?" "Some federal rehabilitation program in Colorado. Reduced sentence for cooperation. He's been teaching financial literacy classes to other inmates." Albert raised an eyebrow, almost amused. "Teaching ethics, perhaps?" Elena smiled faintly. "He wrote me again. Said he's trying to change." Albert didn't answer right away. "And do you believe him?" "I don't know," she admitted, "but I think I need to." Albert nodded slowly. "Forgiveness isn't for him, you know. It's for you." She looked at him, studying the lines in his face, the calm that had replaced all fire. "Did you ever forgive him?" He considered the question. Finally, he said, "I think forgiveness is just a quieter form of revenge, when you decide the other person no longer matters enough to hate." Elena stared at him for a long moment, then laughed softly. "You always make mercy sound so logical." "Old habits," he said with a shrug. "Lawyers justify everything." Later that evening, as the sun lowered behind the trees, Albert took his grandson for a walk along the river. The child ran ahead, chasing the drifting leaves. His laughter echoed across the quiet park, and something about it, that pure, unfiltered joy, filled Albert's chest with a strange ache he hadn't felt in years. "Grandpa," the boy said suddenly, stopping near the edge of the path, "Mom said you used to fix things. What kind of things did you fix?" Albert smiled gently. "Mostly people's mistakes." The boy thought about that. "Did you fix your own?" Albert paused, looking out at the water. The ripples caught the dying light, gold melting into shadow. "Not all of them," he said softly, "but I tried." The boy nodded as if that was enough. "Mom says everyone makes mistakes." "She's right," Albert said. "The important thing is what you do after them." They stood there together, the old man and the boy, the river whispering secrets between them. That night, after Elena and her son had left, Albert sat at his desk. The moonlight spilled across the papers, and the sound of the clock filled the quiet house. He took out a fresh sheet of stationery and began to write, not because he planned to send it, but because some truths only found peace when spoken, even silently. Nicholas, I've thought about what happened more times than I can count. You once told me that power was about control. I used to believe that too. But control isn't power. It's fear dressed as confidence. I didn't destroy you to win. I did it because men like you destroy without consequence, and I wanted you to understand consequence. Now, I think you finally do. If you've truly changed, then perhaps my cruelty had purpose. If not, it was just another sin, one that I'll have to live with. Either way, the world is quieter now. Maybe that's enough. He folded the letter neatly and placed it in a drawer beside Nicholas's old one. Then he turned off the light and went to bed. That night, Albert dreamed of the Silver Lake Conservatory, that glass-walled dinner hall where everything had begun. But in the dream, the room was empty. No guests, no laughter, no music. Only two chairs, one for him, one for Nicholas. They sat facing each other across a spotless white table. No words were spoken, no anger, no accusation. Just silence, the kind that lives after forgiveness. When Albert woke, dawn was breaking. For the first time in years, he felt light. A month later, a local law school invited him to speak, a guest lecture on corporate accountability and the ethics of exposure. He hesitated at first. He hadn't spoken publicly in years, but something about it felt right, a way to pass on what he'd learned, however dark the lesson. The lecture hall was filled with students, bright-eyed, idealistic, full of the same moral certainty he once had. He began with a story, stripped of names and dates. A man who was humiliated, who retaliated not with violence but with intellect, who sought justice but found only balance. When he finished, a student raised her hand. So, she asked, was he right to do it?
Albert paused. That depends, he said, on whether you think justice is about punishment or prevention. The room went quiet. He continued, in law, we talk about restitution, restoring what's been lost. But some damages can't be repaired. Sometimes the best you can do is make sure no one forgets the cost. After the lecture, a few students approached him, asking for advice, career tips, mentorship. He smiled, patient as always, and answered every question. When he left the campus, the late afternoon light cast long shadows across the quad. He realized he hadn't felt this alive in years, not since before the fall. Winter returned, crisp and unforgiving. Albert's health began to falter. Nothing sudden, just the slow erosion of age. One evening, he walked the river path one last time, the same route he'd taken so many mornings before. He stopped at his favorite bench, sat down, and looked at the city skyline glowing faintly in the distance. The water below was dark and still, reflecting only fragments of light. He thought about the dinner, the revenge, the trial, the sequence of events that had felt like destiny, but now seemed like memory. And he thought about Elena's son, Nicholas Albert Graham, a name that held both sin and salvation in equal measure. He smiled. Life, it seemed, had a sense of irony after all. He whispered softly to the night, balance restored. The wind carried the words away. Died quietly in his sleep that spring. No fanfare, no obituary beyond the standard legal brief. Former corporate investigator, lecturer, survived by his daughter and grandson. Elena found his letters, both of them, in the drawer by his desk. She read them in silence, tears falling not from sorrow, but from recognition. She placed both envelopes in a wooden box labeled Lessons. And inside that box, she added one more note, her own. For my father, who taught me that justice is never clean, but, It's always necessary. Years later, when her son grew up and asked about the man he was named after, she would tell him only the truth that mattered. That name reminds us that even mistakes can lead to wisdom, if you're brave enough to face them. On a bright spring morning years later, a grown Nicholas Albert Graham stood by the same river his grandfather once loved. He was 23, just out of college, holding a journal filled with notes on law and ethics. He opened it to a blank page and began to write. Justice is balance. Not revenge, not forgiveness. Balance. My grandfather taught me that. He never said much about his past, but I think he carried both pride and pain in equal measure. And maybe that's what truth really is. Not purity, but proportion. He looked up at the shimmering water, sunlight flickering across it like memory. Somewhere, in that reflection, he imagined the faint outline of an older man sitting calmly, watching over him, the ghost of consequence and love intertwined. He smiled. Then he closed the notebook and walked away, the river whispering behind him, the same words it had whispered to Albert all those years ago. Balance restored. If you like the video, please like the video, subscribe to the channel, and click the bell icon.